Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Ranji Khanna. I'm the director of the John Hope Franklin Humanities Institute here at Duke University. It's my distinct pleasure to welcome you to our annual event in honor of our namesake, John Hope Franklin. And I'm delighted that we have with us tonight Romila Thapar, Robin Kelly, and Laurent Dubois. In the past, our distinguished annual lecturers have included literary critic Emery Elliott, of course, historian of ancient India, Romila Thapar, philosopher Kwame Anthony Appiah, artist and filmmaker Isaac Julian, art historian, cultural theorist, and video artist Mike Ball, historian of modern France Joan Scott, cultural critic Rob Nixon, poet Natasha Trethewey, and architect and designer David Adjaye. John Hope Franklin's scholarship, as many of you know here, urges us to attend to both the untold stories and the familiar ones. As he puts it, intellectualizing them, seeing their complex layering, understanding how Black studies and Black history in the US are always an intrinsic part of American studies more generally, and that history for him needs to be understood in the context of the world. It is through him that we come to shape our ideas at the Franklin Humanities Institute of understanding South-South relations, the global South within the global North, the history of slavery as a world history, the imbrication of the legal, the economic, and the cultural. John Hope was, of course, an important part of the everyday life of the Franklin Humanities Institute for its first 10 years, as he continued to mine the archive, work in both scholarly and public realms, and participate in the kinds of conversations that we are reflecting on today and that you have hopefully had the chance to view or read through the links on our website. One of our projects at the FHI in recent times, generated partly from what we have learned of the uses of technology for global interaction during these pandemic times, is to go into our extensive archive of recordings of past events and to reanimate them in conversation with each other, almost into mini courses on a variety of topics. When going back through our materials, many of us thought of the conversation between Romila and John Hope on The Historian in the World that was moderated by then director Srinivasa Aravamathan. It was from 2007 and for so many reasons seemed an important conversation to return to for reflection, not least of which is a dynamic of generosity and friendship that animates the conversation and remains an example of how collaboration in the humanities, fields in which scholarship largely, though not exclusively, incurs in solitary archival, museum, and gallery work and writing, functions through an engaged sociality that allows one to think across specificities of area and be responsible to a larger conversation. But also because in the 14 years, so much has shifted, but at the same time seems to have stayed so familiar. Some of the topics engaged, for example, on school textbooks in India and among the Indian diaspora, and in the US, specifically around questions of race, in many countries around the world on the histories and afterlife of colonialism, remain fraught, and the historian's relationship to politics has become a part of everyday conversation, as if governments and the general public have all been trained to assess what constitutes historical evidence, what really happened, how best to make sense of it, and more broadly, what constitutes evidence in the scholarly humanities. We've seen the banalization of historiographical challenges to truth and narrative, complex ideas about narrative theory, philosophical concepts of truth, and the importance and problem of empiricism turned into denial and rejection of fact, and academic investigation of, for example, finding and understanding historical sense through materials such as religious texts that do not fall into the kind of historical account we may find in the Thucydides model, has been used in the world as justification to make all sorts of claims that have no basis in history or historical method. The rethinking of what constitutes history in the post-colonial context something carried out by historians like Romila and Irfan Habib, her friend and colleague for a long time, have often repeated colonial formations of nation states, valorizing borders put in place and erasing regional differences, all things that they tried to move against. At the same time, terms like post-colonial racial capitalism, critical race studies have entered into the mainstream press, even places like Vogue and New York Times style issue, but without a robust sense of the implications they may have for futurity. And the investment in climate change has changed our sense of the scales of history and revitalized an interest in such figures as Brodel and the Annales School of History more broadly, thinking of the minute detail in relation to such things as coastlines of oceans, geological time, and worrying less about human agency as the ground of the historical narrative that it was at one point the main criticism against the Annales School. The idea of a science of history has shifted to one that uses DNA more routinely, that considers biologization of such factors as race as distinct sometimes from the accrual of material meaning to racial biological categories that then have consequences in the world. Present in the room that day in 2007, in addition to the late John Hope Franklin and the late Srinivasa Ramanujan and Romila Thapar, were many friends identifiable by the backs of their heads and the swift walk in front of a camera. Laurent Dubois and Robin Kelly, both historians, were there listening, and Robin, in fact, has written on the event in his tribute to John Hope Franklin when he passed away. Thus, it seemed like an excellent idea to have them as interlocutors to this conversation, to take it further and to consider what it means to be a historian in the world. I'm not going to give extensive introductions for the sake of time, but I will say something briefly about each of them. And I want to thank also Chris Cheer, whose first task when she started working for the Franklin Humanities Institute in 2007 was to organize the original event. And she is still with us, has been shaping the conversations in the humanities we've been having at Duke for a long time. To Lou Brown, who is helping out today. To Sarah Rogers, who was working for us at the Franklin Humanities Institute, who transcribed the original event, and all the staff at the Franklin Humanities Institute. So Laurent Dubois is John L. Now III bicentennial professor in the history and principles of democracy. That's quite a title, and Director for Academic Affairs of the Democracy Initiative at the University of Virginia. He is a specialist on the history and culture of the Atlantic world and studies the Caribbean, particularly Haiti, North America, and France. And prior to joining UVA in 2021, he spent a decade at Duke, where he founded the Forum for Scholars and Publics and co-directed the Haiti Lab at the Franklin Humanities Institute. He is the author of 7 books, including A Colony of Citizens, Revolution and Slave Emancipation in the French Caribbean, 1787 to 1804, which won the Frederick Douglass Prize, and 3 other book prizes. And Haiti, The Aftershocks of History, Macmillan 2013, a New York Times Notable Book of the Year, and The Banjo, America's African Instrument, from Harvard 2016, which was supported by a Guggenheim Fellowship and a National Humanities Center Fellowship, Mellon New Directions Fellowship. His writings on music, history, and sports have appeared also in the press, in The Atlantic, The Nation, The New Republic, The New Yorker, New York Times, Slate, and even Sports Illustrated. Robin Kelly is Distinguished Professor of History and African American Studies and Gary B. Nash Endowed Chair in U.S. History at the University of California at Los Angeles. His research explores the history of social movements in the U.S., the African diaspora, and Africa, extending into research on Black intellectuals, music and visual culture, and surrealism and Marxism. Prolific author, his most recent books are Africa Speaks, America Answers, Modern Jazz in Revolutionary Times, from Harvard in 2012, Thelonious Monk, The Life and Times of an American Original, Free Press 2009, and he's the co-editor of numerous books, including The Russian Revolution, A View from the Third World, by Walter Rodney and co-edited with Jesse Benjamin from Verso 2018. Romila Thapar is Professor Emerita in History at Jawaharlal Nehru University and has served as visiting professor at a number of academic institutions around the world, including various colleges in London University, Cornell, University of Pennsylvania, the Collège de France in Paris, a leading scholar on ancient India, the leading scholar on ancient India, one should say. Her work has been part of the shift from treating an ancient history as Indology to establishing it as a social science. And during her illustrious career, Thapar has produced over 20 volumes, including Ashoka and the Decline of the Mauryas from 1961, Ancient Indian Social History, some interpretations from 1978, The Penguin History of Early India from the Origins to AD 1300. In addition to numerous honors from around the world, she was awarded the John W. Kluge Prize for the Study of Humanity in 2008, 2 years after John Hope Franklin had actually received the same award. And the Kluge Prize, for those of you who don't know, is an international award given by the US Library of Congress for lifetime achievement in humanistic disciplines not covered by the Nobel Prizes. So today we are going to start with Laurent, who's going to give us some reflections on the original event and some of the topics that came up there. Over to you, Laurent. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Ranji, and of course it's a huge pleasure and honor to be part of this conversation today. As part of this group, it was very powerful for me to return to the recording from 2007. This was the first fall I was a professor at Duke University, and remains for me probably one of the more extraordinary events that I attended during my time there. And kind of wonderful to also hear that this was Chris's first event, Chris, who shaped our lives at Duke so deeply. So I'm grateful to be brought back to that moment. Of course, it does bring a sense of deep loss and mourning too, to go back to that time. But I was struck as well, and want to carry into this conversation today, the sense of imminence I felt in watching the conversation. The feeling that Srinivas and John Hope are very much with us still and part of our thinking and our work. This is also a wonderful conversation for me to be in, to kind of think about lineage and influence, because Robin Kelly, as an interlocutor, Robin was a very important part of my life as a historian. I studied with him during my first year at the University of Michigan. And I'd say so much of my approach to what being a historian really means has been shaped by that. And I've long admired the way he has inhabited the role of a historian in the world. So it's great to be here with him too. And of course, to be in conversation with Romila, who I admire so much. So to quote Dr. Franklin from early in the talk, he said that he was going to put on his running shoes and try to keep up in the conversation, and I'll try to do the same today. Now, the conversation in 2007 turned around a set of themes that are both permanent features of historical work and feel utterly urgent in the present moment. The relationship between historians and the popular imagination and broader culture, the political importance and depth and intensity of struggles around the telling of history, and the question for historians, I think, of how to navigate these currents, both as scholars committed to a particular kind of work and research, and committed to being present in the world beyond the academy and participating in these broader currents. In the 15 years or 14 years, I guess, since the conversation has happened, we might say that certain things have changed, but many others have not, as Ranji said earlier. I was very struck, for instance, early on by Romila's early comment about the ways in which historical debates are often defined by kind of unidirectionality. That is, that scholars in the West feel free to largely ignore debates going on in other parts of the world, while that luxury, of course, is not afforded to scholars outside the West, who are expected to follow and know all about the theoretical debates in European and US contexts. I think that remains true in many ways, though I would say the last decade or so has seen a strong kind of force or action of recentering or decentering. I'm thinking of my own fields in kind of Caribbean and Haitian studies and the relationship between Caribbean and US studies. Though it's shifted, I think, and is changing, I do think there are still ways that remains very true, and that certain intellectual debates and genealogies continue to be quite fetishized in our disciplines, and that a deeper decentering and move towards a sense of multivalent theoretical debates seems vital. So it seems like that was one important intervention. Interestingly, Dr. Franklin responded to that in kind of criticizing the kind of sense of arrogance that he felt some historians take about their own interpretations, in particular modern historians. And there was something wonderful in that conversation about the way that a sense of humility and curiosity, not just towards each other, towards one another as historians, but also towards the human experiences that historians seek to speak of and understand, was kind of embodied there. And I think that's something to take with us as we work. Now, really, the core of the conversation, a big chunk of the time, was devoted to fascinating discussions of controversies over textbooks, which were both kind of reassuring and discouraging at the same time. Because it was a reminder that what we're experiencing today, notably in Virginia, where I now teach, has been a constant feature of our political landscape through much of the 20th century. And I think one can't help but feel, as if you listen notably to John Hope Franklin's riveting account of the controversies in the 1960s about the land of the free textbook that he had co-written, it can feel like we're in a kind of constant spiral, right? A repetition with the difference when it comes to how we tell histories and how deeply fraught this kind of question in particular of telling African-American histories or histories of slavery in the United States is. Some of what he was recounting from decades ago sounded almost like a description of events in the past year in Virginia and other states. And there's a powerful moment, I think, where Dr. Franklin talks about the moment when his photograph was placed up on a screen to show opponents of the textbook that one of his authors was African-American. And this became kind of a particular topic of resistance on the part of people protesting this textbook. So I urge you, if you haven't watched it, to go and watch that section of the conversation. It did make me think, though, as well, of what has changed in the last 15 years, or the new kind of struggles we're in, because obviously things aren't the same in many ways and have changed. One interesting difference that came to mind was that how much the conversation has become very explicitly one about historiography itself in a certain way, about, in other words, not just the content of history, but the very terms of the writing of history are really out in the open. I think this is notably true around the well-known struggles around Confederate monuments that have occupied much of the country, but of course have been particularly intense in Virginia, in Charlottesville, in North Carolina, in Durham, in Richmond over the past 5 years. And the kind of education that has gone on around this has been in many ways remarkable. It strikes me that if, at one point localities had simply been given the opportunity, as I think they should, to determine what kinds of monuments there would be in their parks, this would never have happened. But because of the resistance to kind of taking down Confederate monuments, there's been a whole education for many people through protests, through democratic participation at level of city and state governments, in particular, not so much about the Confederacy, but about the history of the 1920s or the early 20th century when these monuments were put up. So people have kind of had to learn that these monuments are not really so much about the Civil War, but about a moment of kind of resistance to African-American enfranchisement and to political participation. And that learning, I think, has been really important. And sort of activists have learned about the way in which historiography itself is integrated with and sort of fundamentally part of political processes. And that seems to me, despite all of the part of what comes out of those struggles, that's been kind of useful and important for the conversation. There's also simply just a multiplying landscape through which historians intervene in the conversations. We can obviously think of the 1619 Project, driven, of course, by journalists, but involving historians, and then the controversy that has pulled all kinds of people into it. We could discuss it in great detail. There's so much to say that I'll just mention it, but it does sort of bring home, of course, how frightening a certain kind of lucid and honest engagement with the past that was advocated for in 2017 continues to be for many in this country. Of course, this is, I think, in a way, a confirmation of just how vital the work of history is, and the intensity of attempts to prevent engagements with the history of slavery, particularly, I think, are inspiration, right, for us to continue doing that work. And I'll talk a bit more about some of the ways people are doing that as well. I feel like historians, including, I think of a couple of the students that I've worked with over the years who are now professors, are deploying many different mechanisms for intervening, of course, in the conversation. We can think of social media, something we could talk about, whether it's for the good or bad, but there is a way in which historians activity in social media and occupation of certain kinds of spaces in the public sphere is really important, I think. I think of the work of something like the African American Intellectual History Circle that has created a really interesting kind of public interface of their own, kind of on their own terms, that has shaped conversations. And then the work of, in fact, the Made by History series at the Washington Post, one of whose editors, Keisha Blaine, has worked in the African American Intellectual History Circle. And the work of kind of editors working closely with a publication like the Washington Post, essentially to get historical knowledge and interpretations regularly into these venues. This has kind of come home to me in the field of Haitian studies a few times in the past years. As we know, kind of Haiti is often ignored in the US press, but then there are these kind of moments of intense focus. And for those of us in Haitian studies, there's always a sense of kind of responsibility when something happens, that one has to sort of speak up and try to counter the narratives that are often in place in the US press or elsewhere about Haiti and the history of Haiti. And there was a time early in my career where this sort of felt like there was only a small group of people who would take that role. And in recent years, basically, as soon as something happens in Haiti, I can wake up and see a variety of op-eds with a lot of really strong historical evidence put forward about the US occupation of Haiti or the history of the country. So there's a sense, I think, in which more and more graduate students have come through and then thought about this as part of their responsibility, essentially, that there's a kind of responsibility to intervene. And I think the focus in graduate education that I think many of us have tried to work on to give people tools for public scholarship so that they can go into the work of history, having that as part of their capacity has been important. I'll mention one more example before concluding, which I recently visited. So in Virginia, James Madison's plantation called Montpelier has gone through over the last couple of years a profound revision of the way that they kind of bring people into the space, and a structural change too, as well, in the sense that the board has recently been restructured so that the majority of the board overseeing this site are now descendants of enslaved people from that plantation who have organized themselves into kind of a group that works with historians to create a different interpretation of it, so that when you go to this plantation, you actually are very much placed within the context of the experiences of the enslaved. And there's a very powerful exhibit that's actually the underground, basically, of the basement area, the cellars of the whole plantation, that tells the story of the specific stories of enslaved people on that plantation, of their lives, and more broadly, the story of the imbrication of slavery and the American history. So it's a quite powerful project, in part because spaces like that, I think, are ones that can really leave a mark on people who are visiting. So that's sort of the taking of those spaces and making them into something different. And Monticello is another example of that, obviously, is quite important, I think, as part of the landscape, and the extent to which historians sort of are involved in those things can be very important. So I'll just conclude by saying that what I take away today from going back to that conversation in 2007 really is the kind of courage, the grace, the generosity with which Professors Thapar and Franklin always engaged with these questions. They show, I think, the power of a certain careful but determined insistence that we do the work of history with clarity and purpose. And I think the years ahead will call upon us as historians to develop new forms of practice anchored in these values and in the kind of spirit of generosity that was powerfully animated that conversation in 2007. So, thank you.
Okay. So good morning, everyone. It's morning for me. Thank you so much, Laurent, for that really coherent, unlike what I'm about to talk about, presentation. Let's see. There we go. Okay. So let me jump in here. First of all, I just have to say what an honor it is when I got the invitation to be here and have this conversation, despite the fact that it's like 6 a.m. for me. I jumped on it because, as Laurent said, this particular conversation that day was very special. And I just have to say what an honor it is to be with such distinguished historians. Yes, Laurent took a class or two with me at Michigan, but I learned way more from him and still learning. And of course, to be here with the brilliant Romila Thapar is also quite an honor. Let me give some backstory because I was there at that conversation on October 27th by sheer accident. I happened to be on campus because my daughter, Elisa Kelly, was a freshman, first year student at Duke, and that was Parents Weekend. And I also had a chance to run into Laurent and have a conversation. But I remember the great composer T.J. Anderson saying, you're here at Parents Weekend. Dr. Franklin's about to give a talk. You need to go. You need to go. So he shuttled me over there. And of course, I got to sit in the audience and watch this extraordinary conversation. So revisiting it was pretty moving for lots of different reasons. I mean, both because I remember almost word for word the kind of key moments of the conversation and what I took from it. The other reason was that it became a catalyst for my year, which as the Harmsworth Chair at Oxford University 2009-2010. And you have to think about the sequence of events. This is 2007. Obama's campaign is taking place throughout 2007, 2008. My daughter's becoming a young scholar. And by the way, she did get her PhD from Columbia. She started as undergraduate here. And she's now teaching at Yale University. So she's done pretty well for herself. So you have to imagine I begin my appointment as the first non-white Harmsworth professor at Oxford University, a professorship that's been there since 1922. And Dr. Franklin, as some of you, I've written a little bit about this, but Dr. Franklin was actually not invited, but he was chosen by Oxford University to be the Harmsworth Chair in 1957. But his appointment was blocked by the American Historical Association. They may have had the same feelings about him that the protesters around his textbook may have had, but he wasn't selected. But he was selected as the Pitt Chair at Cambridge in 1962. And for me, all this came together in a strange way because I was born in 1962. He was 47 when he accepted the Pitt Chair, which in some ways, I wouldn't say it was a consolation, but it was his opportunity to hold a really important endowed chair at a British institution. And it just so happened that when I accepted the Harmsworth Chair, I was 47 years old as well. In my my only sort of Harmsworth lecture, I talked about this. I talked about Dr. Franklin because he had passed on March 25th, 2009. So I saw him in 2007. I didn't see him since then. I was trying to reach out to him. He was very, very busy, then ill when my daughter was on campus, but I didn't see him again. And so in many ways, my lecture was dedicated to not only Dr. Franklin's memory, but to everything that he stood for, especially in relationship to the fact that that was also, basically the year right after Obama was elected. So much of my talk was about Obama's election, the U.S. history and its discontents in the Obama era, and what Dr. Franklin did in terms of really contributing or participating in the public around questions of racism, how to write U.S. history, how to revise it in the context of political crises. Okay, so there were two themes that came up in the conversation I wanted to address. And in fact, of course, one was something that Laurent talked about, and I'll say more about that. But one had to do with history and political identity then and now. I mean, it was interesting to hear both Professor Thapar and Professor Franklin respond to the question of the relationship between history and identity, and thinking especially about the fact that in India, Professor Thapar talks about all these struggles to revise textbooks, and she talks about how, if you moved our textbooks and put in a new lot of textbooks, some shaped by the BJP, when they were out of office, they were shaped by other circumstances, and it was this kind of wish for an independent commission to vet textbooks. So what we're seeing in the U.S., we're seeing in India, that is the political contestation around telling this history in schools. And this is not a new thing. And of course, I would love to hear what Professor Thapar has to say after the election of Modi and the way in which, once again, Hindu nationalism is shaping the way we understand, not just within India, but globally and throughout the diaspora, how we understand the contestation over Indian history. Jump to the United States, as Laurent had mentioned, if you haven't heard the conversation, I really encourage you to do so, because the story that John Hope tells about his textbook is pretty extraordinary, and he does it in such a kind of dry sense of humor. It's like, here are the facts. And his race was a factor. The fact that people were coming up, showing up at these demonstrations against the land of the free, the textbook, reading passages from the Communist Manifesto, which actually is not a bad thing, but this was as a way to link this textbook to communism. And of course, it is a liberal interpretation of U.S. history, a quite powerful one. I actually have the book. I meant to pull it out here because I was so astounded I had to just check it out. In any case, if you without going into a lot of details, you link that story. The story that he tells is the story of historical contestation in the United States for a century and a half at least. Around that time, Gary Nash, well, later, but they write about this. Gary Nash, Charlotte Crabtree, and Ross Dunn published this book called History on Trial, which is really about their efforts to introduce a national standards in U.S. history. And they point to this story in 1961, not in the U.S. South, not in the old Confederacy or the new Confederacy, but in Meridian, Connecticut, backed by the Daughters of the American Revolution, that insisted on banning textbooks they deemed, quote, subversive, and that contained images. Now you got to understand this. What is subversive? Images of poverty, any material on the United Nations, anything having to do with suggesting that Americans might be prejudiced, anything having to do with mental health, and writings of, quote, liberal, racial, socialist, or labor agitators, that all this is subversive and needs to be removed. That's 1961. It hasn't changed. The current struggles around so-called critical race theory, which is not really that, but we can talk about that. These are textbook struggles as well. They didn't begin after January 6th. They began, in the 19th century, but really took off again in another iteration with Donald Trump's 1776 commission in response to the 1619 Project. And much of these politics are driven by ethno-nationalism, by white victimhood, and by heteropatriarchy. Because keep in mind, of course, that a lot of the attacks on texts are not just around race. A lot of them are around trans identity, queer identity, abortion rights, and all these struggles are using the law and mobilizing a kind of mob mentality to eliminate the threat of the other, threat of difference, to purify the country. And New Hampshire is a really good example. Again, You don't have to go to Alabama. You can go to New Hampshire, the home of deep conservatives, where Moms for Liberty were offering $500 reward for turning in teachers who are violating the state's anti-critical race theory law. One last thing before I talk about the nation state, and that is that when Dr. Franklin was asked the question about social progress in history, they both were asked the question. He had this interesting quote where he says, maybe race was a factor, was maybe the main factor in the history of the country. And he says he's persuaded that race was central and that African labor was foundational to the colonial economy. And he called for what he identified as a more racial, or at least sort of race-sensitive interpretation. But what he describes in this sort of envisioning how history might move forward was essentially the 1619 Project. He says much of the history was about creating this labor supply, this supply of African labor, and he said it ought to be explored more than we have explored it. Now, of course, that doesn't make the 1619 Project perfect or whatever, but it does suggest that what Dr. Franklin was pushing toward actually came to fruition in terms of thinking about origins. The last thing I want to sort of address very, very briefly, because I know our time is short, and I'd love to hear what other people have to say, has to do with this question of the nation state. And both Professor Thapar and Professor Franklin made really profound points about post-nationalist histories. And of course, in ancient histories, on the surface at least, the question of the nation state and its hegemony seems to be less an issue precisely because, ancient histories precede the rise of the modern nation state. On the one hand. On the other hand, ancient history is the ground upon which so many nationalist discourses are built. It's subject to political contestation, all kinds of claims, all in the name of the nation state and its glory. And this is how, again, nation states are built ideologically, this kind of claim to historical precedent. But what we've seen, I think, over the last 10, 15 years, probably more than that, is a real shift in terms of not just a critique of the nation state per se, but a recognition that sometimes anti-colonial nationalist movements, including movements to end enslavement, have actually not been nation-building projects. They've been kind of global, transnational kinds of projects, despite the fact that they might be under the name or under the framework of nationalism. So I think about, of course, Laurent's work on Haiti is a really good example, and his writing on the revolts in the French Caribbean. I'm also thinking about Adam Getachew, Vijay Prashad, Gary Wilder, Monique Badassi, Manu Goswami, Brent Hayes Edwards, Minka Makalani. There's a forthcoming book by Musab Yunus, Ani Mukherjee, Moon Ho Jung, Christina Hetherington, all have written works that reveal in many ways how the dominant strains of anti-colonial nationalisms were less about nation building than about what Adam Getachew calls world making. And she has this amazing book, World Making After Empire, which looks at precisely what Professor Thapar was talking about, like thinking from the global south. That is, anti-colonial nationalists of the global south who understood decolonization as she puts it, as Getachew puts it, a project of reordering the world that sought to create a domination-free and egalitarian international order. In other words, thinking global. And there's so many other examples of that. We could talk about Gary Wilder's book, Freedom Time, where he looks at the kind of post-nationalist vision of Aimé Césaire and Léopold Senghor, who are proposing forms of association between the former colonies in France itself in order to explode the existing nation state from within. And it's different models of decolonization. And finally, a brand new book that's about to come out by Musab Yunus called On the Scale of the World, which does something similar, looking at anti-colonial intellectuals in the interwar years, which again is making the case that the only way to really destroy the racial colonial order was to fight on the planetary or the world scale. And in the face of climate catastrophe, and in the face of a neoliberal order that has always seen its force, the system of capitalism on a world scale. It's really, really important to see these precedents, these historical precedents, for thinking beyond the nation state, critiquing the nation state, critiquing national nation building. And I just want to end just by reminding us, and I'm thinking about Quinn Slobodian's excellent, extraordinary book, The Globalists, which argues that the neoliberals never loved nationalism. In fact, they thought economic nationalism was a disaster, was dangerous. And they wanted to create these strong supranational institutions to protect what? Private capital rights. And you could see the same thing with the kind of liberal globalism, of liberal developmentalism, creating the World Bank, the IMF, the ILO, the disastrous Green Revolution, and what it meant for remaking the world in which the nation states are subordinate to capital. Whereas the anti-colonial vision is one in which the nation state, needs to move out the way in order to create a kind of global order to save the planet and to end capital's rights to destroy everything and everyone around them. So these are the things I take away from the development of scholarship since then, but also those core ideas were there in that initial conversation. So I'm going to stop there and let's, I guess, I'd love to hear what Professor Thapar has to say about this.
Thanks so much, both of you. Over to Romila.
Let me begin by saying that I'm absolutely delighted, utterly delighted with the possibility of going back to the old conversation, missing John Hope enormously because I did so enjoy chatting with him. And secondly, moving forward to thinking about what has happened in the last 15, 16 years, 14 years. And I was really most interested to hear what Laura and Robin had to say, because in a sense, that's what I'm going to be talking about too. And I think that that is one of the striking features of what has happened to historical studies, that it's not only extended its reach globally, but we're all in conversation with each other now, which is really quite remarkable. And on the other hand, when I was going through the transcript of the conversation with John Hope, I kept saying to myself, how true it is that so much changes, but so much remains the same. And the issues that we've taken up this evening, and which I'm also going to take up and talk about because they're very pertinent to the South Asian situation, really are issues that are a continuity in the conversation that took place 14 years ago. I mean, I can't hope possibly to cover all the very interesting points that were made. And in a sense, it would be nice to maybe have a day-long seminar on this and just take them up point by point and discuss them in detail. But let me just pick up 2 or 3 things which I think are extremely pertinent, not only to the writing of history today, but in fact, very pertinent to what is going on with the study of history in all our countries. I'd like to talk about historiography, and I'd like to talk a little bit about textbooks as well. Go back to the old theme that we touched on earlier. Historiography has become, in many ways, a new thing. It's been slowly encroaching, as it were, on traditional conservative historical studies and is now recognized as extremely important. I mean, we in our university have, since it began in the 1970s, we had a whole course on what we call the historical method. And that course has now grown and grown and grown, and people have brought in different aspects of historiography into the course. And what did we mean by this when we gave so much emphasis to historiography? I mean, at that point, of course, we were concerned with the immediate issue, which was that the history of India had been written by those who colonized us. It was the history of the colonizers' understanding of the Indian past. And we, over the years since independence, but even earlier, had been writing histories that were different, that questioned some of these histories. There was the colonial approach and there was a nationalist approach. And when we started writing in the middle of the 20th century, we were questioning both the colonial and the nationalist approach. And then what was very interesting, of course, was that we went on to speak about decolonization, which was extremely important. It was very important for two reasons. One that was very obvious at that time, that the perceptions of the Indian past by colonial writers were through the gaze, the vision, the look, the understanding of colonialism. That was what gave a framework to them to try and reconstruct the past. I'll give you two examples that have been picked up out of this colonial interpretation, partly also linking up with what was spoken about earlier. The first was, of course, the invention of the Aryan race, and how all Hindus go back, have an ancestry in this Aryan race, and therefore are superior. But anyway, this went on then to other kinds of history, but this remained a very basic feature. And I will in a moment explain why it's important to us to understand this. And the other was, of course, what has commonly been called the two-nation theory, that the colonial understanding of the Indian past was that it consisted of always having had two nations, the Hindu nation and the Muslim nation, constantly at war with each other, constantly hostile. And of course, it was the two-nation theory that went towards making it much easier for the creation of Pakistan. And now its counterpart, which is being talked about all the time, the creation of a similar kind of religious Hindu state, which is called the Hindu Rashtra. Now, decolonizing Indian history, therefore, was important, not only to point out that there were flaws in the way in which the history of the past had been constructed by colonial writers, but that it was continuing in a kind of disguised fashion even today. And this really ties up with the question of nationalism, which was brought up, and which is really, it's surfaced in a way in which you can't get away from it when you're looking at the contemporary way in which history is being treated. What do I mean? I go back, in fact, to that marvelous statement in Eric Hobsbawm, who says that history was to nationalism what the poppy was to the opium addict. And I keep on thinking, my God, that was absolutely right. Nationalism cannot be nationalism without having some kind of history that it calls into play every time it has to legitimize itself. History is essential for the legitimization of nationalism, whatever kind of nationalism one may be dealing with. What I mean by this is that in the Indian past, in recent past, since independence, we've really had two kinds of nationalisms contending with each other. One was the secular democratic nationalism, which was the intellectual dynamite, as it were, of the independence movement, of the freedom movement. And it's the one that, you know, we all grew up with, we subscribe to, and so on. And it is the one that we as historians wrote, contradicting the colonial interpretation. The other kinds of nationalism, which also became very, not so strong, but somewhat strong in the beginning, but have since become much more strong, is religious nationalism. Now, there are people who argue that this is a contradiction in terms, that you cannot describe nationalism, qualify nationalism, by talking about religious nationalism, because nationalism is a different kind of experience. It's a coming together of communities and people towards the creation of something new historically. You shed the kingdoms and you shed everything that went with that, and you're now building a democratic nation state. So you're building something very different, and therefore the history has to change. And nationalism is not something that draws its legitimacy from religion. It draws its legitimacy much more from the way in which people were represented, and the whole process of demanding representation, and the process of working out institutions that would give support to democratic functioning. However, nationalism did keep to one thing, and that was the search for the golden age. As you know, every civilization in the 19th century had to have a golden age. So when nationalism came into being in the early 20th century, where was the golden age of India? And it was taken back to the Gupta period, which is essentially a period of the decline of Buddhism and the rise of what is sometimes called the Hindu Renaissance. So that kind of historical writing also gave great support to the notion of religious nationalism. Now we're at a situation where there is a complete confrontation between those that grew up through the channel of secular democratic nationalism, and those for whom nationalism only means one thing, and that is religion. As it happened when Pakistan was created, it was Islamic nationalism. And now, of course, the present system is the one that is trying its level best to establish a Hindu state. And the battle is going on the how to use history and how to draw legitimacy from different interpretations of history. Inevitably, wherever there is an overstress on needing history to legitimize an ideology, there is an exaggeration of that history. So we are today facing a situation where the issue of the Aryan race and the beginnings and the foundations of Hindu civilization in the Aryan race are extremely important, have to be indigenous, and there are certain qualifications that it has to adhere to. And these are not historically acceptable to professional historians. Nevertheless, this is what is being pushed, and this is, in the public view, this is regarded as history. And I'll come to that in a moment. But there's this, and the other, of course, issue, which is very important, is that if you are going to have a Hindu state, then you must make sure that the Hindu citizen is superior to the others, that there is a hierarchy in citizenship, there is a priority given to a particular category of citizens based on the religion that they adhere to. So that is a battle that we are facing, and we're facing that battle in two ways. One is through textbooks. We're back to that again. And it's strange how, in a funny kind of way, that ever since textbooks have been written, they have been contentions over textbooks, and this continues. I mean, in India, it really became quite funny at one point that every time the government changed, the textbooks changed, because the ideology of the party in power differed from the ideology of the previous party. Now we have a party in power that supports this ambition of setting up a Hindu state. So all of history is directed towards that change. And in order to make this successful, the minority communities, the religious minority communities, their history is sought to be underplayed, if not annulled. And there is that contention which is also going on. And all of this is being reflected now in the debate between the professional historians and the public. In fact, the debate has not really been a very big debate, because there's been a sense in which we've participated but we haven't how long can you go on arguing with people who do not understand the discipline? And this is one of the problems that we do face, because what has happened is that in the last 50 years, or prior to the last 50 years, history was a narrative. You picked up your sources, and your sources told you that this happened, and then that happened, and the other happened. And if you thought that the source was a good source, you quoted from it, and you built up a story and a narrative. And much of Indological history, although technically superb, I mean, the mechanisms and the technologies that were used to decipher scripts and to read inscriptions and bring in archaeology and so on, first rate. The gathering of sources was first rate, but the reading of the sources was rather mechanical, that you just picked up your statements from the different books and put them together. As history shifts to becoming a social science, the first thing that happens is the question of analysis. You pick up a source, you have to analyze it. And you have to do what I sometimes used to tell my students, that you have to observe the 4 A's. But what are the 4 A's? Who's the author? And you have to find out as much as you can about the author, even if the author is ancient, in terms of, what was his makeup and what was his intellectual position and what were the ideas that he was projecting and why was he doing so, etc., etc. So the author has to be examined, which really was never done very much before in the past. It's something that is just beginning in the last 2 or 3 decades. Then you have the agency. Who is the patron? Who is enabling that author to write? Because do remember that when you're dealing with ancient history, you're not dealing with a democratic society in which everybody was educated and everybody was writing histories. You're dealing with certain people who were selected and who received the patronage of those that are in a position to provide patronage, and they write in response to that patronage. It can be a monastery, it can be a king, it can be a temple, it can be anything of these things, but there is that relationship which has to be considered. Then the content of what is being said. What is the purpose? What is the purpose of writing what is being written? Because as we all know, I mean, we take it for granted now that everything that's written, even including our own books, they have an intention, they have a purpose. And so that has to be written. And finally, the audience. Who is it being written for? That just ties in with the purpose for which it is being written. Who is your audience? Now, when you put these 4 categories together, you insist on a certain kind of professional training for the historian, which is the kind of thing that the better universities are doing. And that training is what differentiates the professional historian from the public figure who gets up and spouts whatever he or she wants to about the past and says, oh, this is history. And part of our problem is to say, sorry, this is not history. This is your opinion based on your limited reading, your hearsay, or whatever it may be. The historical analysis suggests a rather different picture. And this is the kind of problem that we are, in fact, facing today in this situation. When you raise this question of this is not the kind of history that the historian is writing, our history reads differently, you're promptly described as anti-national. You're not only described, you're accused of anti-nationalism, and occasionally there's worse to follow. Now, I think that this is really a very problematic situation because apart from just what has happened in the past, where we fought colonialism, we got our freedom, we became a nation, we're writing the history of the nation, as it were. Let's not forget that all the colonies that were created through colonialism have today become nations, and they're all busy writing their national history. And the concept of a national history, therefore, has become a very complicated history. It's not an easy history. And for example, in an area like South Asia, you've got 3, 4, 5 states, independent states. You've got other states which are with a very strong regional culture, who are also now beginning to say, well, you know, we have a history which is not quite the same as the history of the state up north. Ours is a little different, and so on. What is going to be the future? This is a question I'm asking. I don't know. What is going to be the future? How are we going to weld these histories? Are we going to weld them into one great big mass called the history of a particular subcontinent or even a continent? Or are we going to decentralize these histories and look creatively at the differences that might exist between the different regions? I mean, I don't know how it is in other parts of the world, but certainly this is something that we will have to give a lot of thought to. Not in any sense of, you know, the nation is breaking up or anything, not at all. The nation is very much there. But these regional differences have a right to a place in the sun. And how are we going to locate these differences in a larger picture? Now, I think that one of the positive things that has come from the changes that have happened in history, that began very much earlier, but have intensified in the last couple of decades, is the awareness that historians now have of histories of other parts of the world. In fact, some of us urge our students to read very widely, because these histories then give you some idea of the kinds of questions that you can ask from your own histories. So comparative history is no longer just, this is what happened here and this is what happened there, and we have these two parallel histories that face each other. It's much more a case of, this is what happened here. Why did this happen? How did this happen? And if we can ask questions of this, are there some questions here that we can ask of the other, where you also have a history where things have happened and so on? So I think that one of the positive features is this business of history getting globalized, not in the sense of simply everybody learning about the history of everywhere from Peru to China, No. But history getting globalized in the sense of people learning to analyze, learning from the histories of other countries, what the patterns were, and then learning to analyze their own history from some of those patterns. And I think this, in a sense, makes it extremely exciting and very challenging too, because in a sense, you're no longer just digging in your own little hole in the ground and burying yourself deeper and deeper into that hole, but you're really surfacing and looking very widely. And I think that really is the essence of good historical writing. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Romila. Thank you, Robin. Thank you, Laurent. Maybe we can all be put onto the screen now, so the four of us can be in conversation together. And I'm going to ask a question that has come up in the Q&A, and I'm just going to adapt it slightly to pick up on some of the things that have been said here, because it seems that one of the things, Romila, that you're talking about in terms of the professional historian, I think is appropriate to the question that has come up, because one of the things that is what's being asked about is about a sort of crisis of recruitment in history, which is fueled in part by the job market crisis and the instability of the economy, lack of job security, etc. But it's also in the context of India, I think, as I understand it, something that becomes a kind of impossible situation when people are being hired into a position and being asked to explain, for example, their understanding of religion in relation to history. So partly I think that this is a question about sort of the concrete the concrete sort of side of there being fewer jobs, the job market, how one actually thinks about being a professional historian, given that there is an insecure job market. Another is perhaps about this sort of question of the way in which institutions are shaping the form of historian who is in place in academic jobs at the moment as well, and who will then be responsible for training people moving forward. So I'll any of you can jump in here, of course, and Romila, I suppose I'm thinking in particular of some of the questions around sort of the rights of academic freedom as well in this regard. Thank you.
I mean, I'll just say one quick thing, and which is, and it was what I was thinking, gesturing towards a little bit at the end of the presentation, which is I do think that we have, as a field, let's say, we have to grapple with the fact that history is intensely in the public light, that it will continue to be intensely in the public light, and it's sort of, so we have to craft a way of dealing with that, and that of course does mean thinking structurally about how history is taught and what it means in our universities, and I think advocating for its importance within the university structures. But it also, I think, means figuring out how to be, good at kind of participating in these conversations and building alliances with with cultural institutions, like what I was mentioning with Montpellier or the Plaintiff. There's a kind of, so being part of that matrix, and of course the historians, and I think Romila and John Hope Franklin are the models here for people who always did that in their lives. But in many precincts of the discipline, I think that's less true. And in some ways, sometimes even students are discouraged from thinking about the kind of public nature of their work. But I think it's inevitable. Obviously, different historians will navigate it in different ways, but we're simply not going to, that was the reminder of watching this talk, which is, if this has been going on for 50 years, and some of the same debates, then we have to be ready to be part of that. So I guess that's what I would say, and which is not to, and I think all the kind of structural and economic and institutional questions raised in the question are vital to that and difficult ones, but they're just a piece of this larger kind of matrix as well. So.
I guess I'll jump in, Birka, just to agree with that, and also to say that part of our task, of course, is to educate all these students coming through at the level of level of undergraduate education. So, what that means is that there's one thing about training to train graduate students to go into the profession. It's another thing to really help students understand what it means. What Romila would mention, what it means to actually interpret it, what we actually do, what it means to interpret and struggle over the questions of interpretation and meaning. And we have to do a really good job of that, because the question of history is something we all have to participate in, not just professionals. In fact, we got to start to erase the divide between professionalization and those of us in a kind of public discourse engaging in this question of the past. And by the way, I just have to show this. So I do have the dangerous, textbook. And this is a really good example, because textbooks are the things, are one entry point into how people understand past. It's already interpreted for them. And we not only have to produce those textbooks, but also figure out like the books that in the texts, in the blogs, in the films, and everything we produce or are part of actually can capture the critical interpretation that is in some ways critical of nationalism, that really is questioning the sort of national myths that drive a lot of these kinds of debates and struggles.
But that's also part of the problem, that, it's the questioning that is resented by those who have all the foolproof answers. And this is where I think it's rather important to tell your students that they're not only professional historians, but they're also going to have to be public intellectuals. If not activists. I mean, we haven't got to the point of training them to be activists as yet, but professional intellectuals, yes, in the sense that they have not just the teaching and the research they're doing, but they also have to explain what they're doing to a wider public. Because a lot of the problems, that we face, for example, here, is that the moment you start saying, well, you get simplistic things like people saying, but how can you have different interpretations in history? Because history is based on facts, and the facts are the same. They never change. So you have to begin to explain that that's really not what history is all about. It's about different things. And then immediately, if you say that it's about this, it's about the societies people create for themselves, the laws of marriages that they create for themselves, the work they do, the labor they put in. Oh, they turn around and say, so you're a Marxist historian. And that kills you. The moment you get the reputation of being a Marxist historian, you're finished. And then, when you get up to give a public lecture somewhere, they introduce you by saying, I have great pleasure in introducing a very controversial historian. And you begin to say, well, what have I done to earn this kind of praise from someone? The point that I'm trying to make is that, one has to now almost go public on this whole question of history is a rational, logical discipline. Sorry, it's not mythology. It's not a story that you and I grew up with and we like very much and we like to tell our children and our grandchildren and so on and so forth. history is different. And you take it or leave it. And if you're going to stand up and say something which is ahistorical, we have a right to say, sorry, this is ahistorical or it's non-historical. And this is where the whole question then of the right to free expression comes in, because people do get arrested for standing up and saying, this is not historical.
Right.
Thank
I mean,
you.
in some ways, history is an extremely sensitive, volatile discipline now.
Yeah.
I'm always reminded of a friend of mine who's one of the leading Sanskritists, a Vedic scholar, absolutely brilliant man, German, who said to me when we were talking about why people take up subjects for research, he said, I said to myself, which is the one area that is totally remote, which no one will pay any attention to. And everybody said the ancient Aryans, the ancient Vedic texts, because it's entirely religious. No one will pay any attention. And now he's in the middle of this whole drama of, are we a race? Are we not a race? Are we indigenous? Are we not indigenous? Absolutely. He says, I don't know why I took the subject up.
Thanks so much, Rona. I'd like to sort of continue this conversation a little bit, taking up what you just said, Romila, and sort of thinking about the question of secularism in relation to the discipline of history. And in so many ways, the way you've described this is, the post-colonial moment had to grapple with that issue of the history of India having been written by the colonizers, the periodization as the Hindu, the Muslim, and then the British, that then got changed pretty much by you and your colleagues to a different kind of sense of periodization, the ancient, the medieval, the modern, for example. And so I'm just wondering if you could, all of you actually, could sort of speak to the question of history as a secular discipline, how one deals with the question of secularism. Well, no, let's just stop there. History as a secular discipline. Yeah.
I'm sorry, I'll just say something quickly. Of course, I think of Chakrabarty's has an essay on some of these questions that I teach my students, and we think about it a lot when we think about kind of the Black Atlantic or the Haitian context, right? Which is that there are these powerful political movements, of course, in the Black Atlantic that were driven by religious, or often kind of centered and connected with religious thinking and practice. And more broadly, there's I think a tension to some extent, especially as we think of decolonizing history between basically different epistemologies, different ways of seeing the world, and how do we think through that, right? And I think this conversation is so fabulous to think about the kind of Indian-US comparisons here. They're obviously very different situations, and yet I think it's a very complex issue for a historian to think about. Quite literally, even just as a kind of in the work itself, which is, from whose perspective is one going to narrate an event in which, say, religious, themes or beliefs were central to the unfolding of the process, right? And how does one think about that, and whose story are you telling? And of course, we are drowning in kind of very loud colonialist sources usually when we write these histories, right, which have their own very specific, need to depict, say, the religiosity of Haitian people or maybe other groups in a certain way, right? And we're in worlds in which we're kind of, I guess we're kind of saturated sometimes by a certain kind of discourse, and I think always trying to figure out how do we kind of move beyond that in some way that is really honest about the stories we're trying to tell. So I think it's one of the most interesting and difficult questions actually in the work. So.
Okay, well, let me say one thing. Sometimes there's a tendency to conflate secular with scientific. So we think about our profession, or you think the historical practice as scientific, and that is debatable. You know, the question of whether or not there is a science to social science, specifically to historical analysis. And I think I just want to just really confirm everything that Laurent had just said, because you know, you know, we both come out of a historical tradition, not so much in the case of India, where you have ruling elites, you know, who represent, you know, religious traditions, and not just religious traditions, but I mean, ruling elites, you know, whether it's the Mughal Empire or the, you know, Hinduism. But in the case of the history of enslaved people and people who are dealing with the kind of post-slavery reality, there's this question of the power of the hand of God, for example. When Du Bois writes Black Reconstruction and describes what the coming of the Lord, you know, meant on the ground for people facing freedom for the first time, the language he uses, the descriptive language, is the language that was appropriate. You know, and this is someone who does believe history as a science, but also as an art, right? So in many ways, we're struggling with that. We're struggling with this question of what are the motive forces. Yes, we can find material forces, and yes, I can be called all kinds of Marxists, which I'm pretty proud of, you know. But that doesn't take away from the fact that things move people in ways that are kind of ineffable, and their explanation for it, which we could take or leave, sometimes is the blood on the leaves, the sign from God, you know. And as historians doing this both as art and as attempting to be kind of objective, but also choosing sides, we have to wrestle with those explanations. I think this is exactly what Laurent is saying. But in every case, and this is, again, to go back to Eric Hobsbawm had a kind of critique of religion and the state, because coming out of European history, he understood religion as associated with the state. You know, that part of the functioning of the state in the kind of pre-Enlightenment, or even during the Enlightenment for that matter, moment is religious order. Whereas we're talking about people for whom the religions justify their own subjugation, and they create a counter religion, a counter hegemonic way of understanding God's will, right? And so that shifts the ground just slightly in terms of thinking about our methods.
Yeah, I've often wondered whether it might be simpler just not to talk about secular history, write it, and to speak it. That is, that in the course of analyzing why an event happened and what effect it had on people and so on, you may go through this whole process of saying, it happened not because God willed it to happen, but it happened because of X, Y, and Z factors, or whatever it may be, without necessarily standing up and saying, now what I'm telling you is secular history. Because one of the problems I find, I have at least with using a qualifier like secular, is what do you mean by secular? You suggested one problem, that it's often equated with scientific, and it doesn't necessarily hold, obviously not. In the Indian case, for example, during the democratic national movement, secular was used repeatedly to mean the coexistence of all religions. It was not used to mean that religion stays out of the picture, please. Right out. We don't want you here. We want other things here. You're very important, but we don't want you here. It's not that. It's the coexistence of all religions. So in fact, you're giving the same priority and importance to religion as the other movements did. But yet you say, I'm secular, and this is secular history that I'm writing. So I think it's really much simpler to say, well, I'm writing history, and this is the way I define what I'm writing. Instead of giving it a label.
Right.
But then, in the battle, these terms come to be used. It's very common now on the social media, for example, and otherwise in a place like ours, where they abuse each other by saying you're a secular historian. No, you're not. You're just anti-national, you're anti-Indian, or whatever it may be. So I think, I don't know what the answer is to that.
Thanks. So sorry, Laurent, you were going to say something. I interrupted.
Just quickly on that, but and I think part of what Robin's also gesturing is when we try to understand an event, right? Part of it is we're trying to understand the kind of future that the people who are doing what we're writing about envisioned, right? So I think that there's part of that, right, which is that certain kinds of prophetic or kind of even utopian ideas about what the future might look like, which connect the material and the spiritual in different ways. I think those, or I find that so often we're trying to find how people made history based on their vision for what future they wanted. And of course, I think nourishing that is always important as well, because we can learn from their visions of the future that have not yet been realized, right? Or so.
Thank you.
At least we can learn what their visions were.
Yeah,
which is very important.
We are already surprisingly at time, but I was wondering if I could just sort of trouble you with one more question that has come up in the conversation and is related to this, I think, because it seems to me that from what I understand, Romila, I mean, the part of the effort to think of a secular history for you was precisely to sort of say, contrary to James Mill's view, Indians do have a sense of the historical, and it is not on this. It is not built on this kind of religious periodization, and we are now a state that is constitutionally secular, and that the discipline of history needs to be rethought in that light. And it was a moment of decolonizing the curriculum, right?
Yeah.
Now, this conversation of decolonizing the curriculum, of course, has taken on a big urgency once again. And I think Laurent was talking about this in relation to the monuments that are coming down, for example, the Roads Must Fall work that's been going on in South Africa, in the UK, elsewhere as well, of course, is all a part of this push to decolonize the curriculum. So, on one level, I sort of think, well, didn't we do that already? Wasn't that the effort that you were making, for example? Wasn't that the effort of post-colonial studies? Wasn't that the effort, once again, of sort of subaltern historians, if one wants to sort of think about different kinds of layers and moments? Isn't that the effort of history from below, of thinking the history of slavery as the history of the Americas more broadly, and not just African American history, for example? It seems as if we did all that, and yet the call is there again. And so I'm just wondering how you respond to the call being there yet again. What is it we failed to do? Did we not fail to do something? Do we just need to bring those, revitalize those conversations again, or what?
We voted in the wrong people for a start.
And I think also, I mean, it's partly to resist teleology when we think about history itself, right? That the history, right? Because I think in some ways, like the struggle that Du Bois waged when he was writing is the same. It's not the same exactly, but in many ways we're still in the same struggle, right? Or it's and I think it's an eternal. I just think we have to understand it as a kind of unending, to some extent, an unending battle, right? That has that gets unfolded and kind of mutates in different ways. And I say that partly because that way I think we need to draw on all of the lessons that many generations have had. It's not that was when John Hope Franklin was talking about the kind of sense of arrogance of some of his contemporaries. I mean, I think we need to definitely not. We should have lots of humility and respect towards the way that prior generations waged that struggle. And I think thinks, that, because I do think it's just inherent to sort of social life and social change. And it's certainly inherent to our modern context. And those questions will keep coming up. I do think that the structural questions in terms of whose voices and what kinds of ways of writing history and all those sorts of things, the more that we can open up the space. And I noticed there were questions about that as well, right? Between academia, between other actors, the kind of things that Robin was telling. So, we have to gather together as many different ways of doing this and not be closed about it, precisely because it's such a large, a very, very important, context.
I also think it's important to realize that, one isn't searching for the single answer. One is open to the fact that, as in all knowledge, one is open to the fact that whatever you're putting forward is liable to be questioned further along the line, and that may lead to totally different answers. And so people must be ready to give those answers. The only thing one makes a plea for is that the way in which the questions are answered must be ways that are acceptable methodologically. But you cannot have mythology thrown at you and then told this is history. That kind of basic distinction has to be made. Otherwise, I think we don't anymore bring up students to believe that what it says in your book is the way it was. You really have to say that, be ready to have this question and be ready to answer why you're supporting this.
Right. Yeah, and I would even, just to concur, you can't decolonize a curriculum without decolonizing the world. So we're still in a colonial present. I mean, it's not as if it's gone. It's shifting and moving. And in fact, when both of you mentioned this sort of as an unending, constant, insistent struggle. And that's what we should expect, because that's part of the reason I even close with the kind of neoliberal order, which is a kind of post-colonial, colonial vision of the world, and that is in which capital has all the rights in the world. The nation state's role is to protect capital at the expense of all these other people, to reproduce the same colonial order, because that vision of the world is one in which so-called poor nations produce raw materials for rich nations that produce finished products, and the wealthy stay wealthy. And so that's the world we live in, and that's the world in which we produce knowledge in. So of course, decolonization is this constant struggle that won't end until we decolonize. And even the idea that thinking of the Americas as the history of slavery itself, which is a very powerful image, is also one that has served to erase indigenous histories at the same time. And thinking about these kinds of relationships. So we're constantly in the struggle, which makes the work interesting. It makes it hard, but it also means that we can't, to go back to, again, Professor Thapar was absolutely right. I'm producing activists, but I shouldn't admit that. But we have a job to do in terms of this constant struggle in the world itself, not just the world of ideas. Because when you, like Mark says, you struggle to change the world, when you struggle to change the world, ideas change. It's not that the ideas are the singular driver to change the world, it's a dialectic. And we have to be part of that dialectic, be aware of it, rather than be triumphant. And that is where, just the final last words, to go back to John Hope Franklin. John Hope Franklin versus Obama. What is the story? In 1993, John Hope Franklin says, we are not nearly anywhere near a post-racial society. When Obama's election takes place, John Hope Franklin says, I'm proud, I'm happy, but we are nowhere near a post-racial society. He says that, but it's like the press didn't even want to deal with that. And Obama's election was the evidence that the moral arc of justice bends towards justice, which is not always true, but it's like evidence that somehow his election proves that history is over, that we're done, that we've achieved everything we're trying to achieve. We shall overcome, we've overcome. And all that's such a myth. And Professor Franklin knew that and understood that. And through his years, I would argue, became more radicalized at the very end of his years than he ever was when he did this book, you know? And this is the lesson here. We're in struggle, you know? And that's what we do as historians. Struggle, write books, write articles, but struggle to try to make this world more in line with a vision that's deeply decolonial.
Thank you so much, all of you, for this really wonderful conversation. I greatly appreciate it. Some of the things that I take away from this last moment is to sort of think on the scale of the world, to sort of try to understand these moments of futurity from any event that we are looking at, to bring a method to our understanding of history, to have a ruthless criticism of absolutely everything in the Marxist tradition, and also to maintain the conversations and to have this sort of spirit of friendship that also underscores humanistic research and ideas moving forward. So I want to thank you all very, very much. I just want to acknowledge that for Romila, it is now 9:45 at night. For Robin started at.
Robin hasn't had coffee yet. Yeah.
Robin hasn't had his morning coffee yet. It's just about okay, I suppose, for Laurent. But really, the only time zone this is suitable for is Europe and Africa, and there is no one in our conversation from either of those places. But in order to put us in conversation with each other, I just greatly appreciate everyone's willingness to participate today. And thank you, and, Romila, once again, very happy birthday for your 90th.
Thank you. This is a lovely celebration.
Happy birthday.
Thank you.
Wow.
Okay, I think.
Thank you, Ranji, for bringing us together and bringing us back to that conversation. It's been wonderful. Really wonderful.
Likewise, thank you so much. We really appreciate it. And happy birthday, Wilma.
Yes.
Thank you.
Birthday.